But let's go with the sort of the sequence of events. We have a first movement that actually happens, according to the storyline, after he has been poisoned and begins dreaming.
That's right.
So he sees his beloved in a couple of different circumstances. Is that right? In the first movement, what do we have here? We have hallucinations. And it says here that he reflects on what life was like before he met her, and then the awakening of the feelings, the elation, the sort of ardent love.
Right.
So it's sort of a building of the emotions that doesn't necessarily have a sequence of actions.
Right. The actions take place in the
afterwards,
the
but there's this sort of build up to that, right? Which is very interesting because it is certainly a very passionate movement. But it starts, again, it's another one of these. It starts kind of slow and
that's right,
and
really ends that
builds,
way.
And ends that
ends
way, right.
essentially with a religious prayer,
right?
But in the middle, of course,
very
a lot of activity.
Right, right. Second movement, he sees her at a dance, right?
That's right.
At a ball.
It's called Umbag.
Right, and it's very much a waltz, right? And what do you think happens during that ball? Did they just dance around and he's sort of looking at her? Or is there, I think there's a little bit of interaction, isn't there, at some point?
Well, of course, it's all open to interpretation.
Yeah, I know.
But
I'm interested what you think.
Yeah, I think it's more that he spots her across the room.
Yeah, this sort of, it's not really, they don't really dance together.
Exactly.
They sort of dance around each other.
It's
right?
kind of like the classic horror movie in the sense that if you think about it, you only get a glimpse of the monster every now and then. If the monster were there on screen the whole time, it would lose its effect.
Yeah.
And so that's the idea here, is that she's such, in the composer's mind or the artist's mind in the program, she's such an ideal, perfect figure that he can't actually talk to her and everything.
It's fun how he does that in the music too, because there really is a sort of elusive quality to it. Lots of little flitting motions where there's that sort of fleeting glance idea, as opposed to the sort of full-bodied, yes, we're dancing together. It's very, very elusive, very interesting. The next third is the scene in the meadows, right?
That's right. Or the
very
countryside.
pastoral, right? Very pastoral, isn't it? It got a lot of figures that we've heard in other sort of pastoral works.
Right. Well, mainly the oboe and the English horn.
Right.
It represents the shepherds calling one another across the valley. Right. And at the very beginning, this is speaking of orchestration, an interesting orchestration technique. He has the English horn on stage, in the normal setup of the orchestra, but the oboist is instructed to go off stage and actually plays from the wings of the theater. And it really does sound like a conversation between the two very far apart. But then, at the end of the movement, when that material comes back, the English horn on stage calls his colleague, but there's no answer.
And no answer. Very painful.
Right. Right.
Very interesting. So the next movement is that march to the scaffold, and we've talked about that. The last movement, I think, is one of those that has so many parts to it that people have tried to analyze it and thoroughly enjoy sort of looking at all the different attributes to it. But I think what inevitably people wind up doing is they wind up saying, well, that's all good, but what's the storyline, right? And it's a very entertaining, at least from that horror film approach, that he draws on several different elements, doesn't he, to really make it a very interesting way of ending the piece. It's called The Witch's Sabbath.
Right, The Dream of the Witch's Sabbath.
Right.
Absolutely, and speaking of horror films, I mean, this really is a horror film, and in fact, it's often played just this movement on Halloween concerts.
Right.
Because it involves monsters and goblins and witches having this grotesque Sabbath around a fire, big pot, that sort of thing. Yeah. And the beloved is represented in this case in a grotesque manner by the E-flat clarinet, which is the high, squeaky member of the clarinet family.
Very grotesque.
Yes. Especially when one tries to play it in tune, which is very difficult. They call it the beast.
Yeah. Well, fortunately, we've got one who's tamed the beast. That's for sure. Well, it's really fun this is one of those movements where it's really fun to know more about what he's drawing upon. So, for example, when the witch's dance really begins, it actually starts with the death chant, right? The Dies Irae from the Requiem Mass, which is fascinating in the sense that people probably would know, the listeners would probably recognize that. You know, maybe not so much today. Although anybody, you know, who worships in a Catholic church would probably recognize it.
Or any concert.
Sure. Who is aware of that sort of thing, or has heard Requiem Masses before. But what's really fascinating to me, at least as a brass player, is how that starts. It starts in the, you know, very high tuba, or in the old days, the ophicleide, which is pretty strange sound. Even on its best days, speaking of beasts.
Exactly.
And it has this sort of otherworldly character to it that is dark and strained, and has that character that really launches us into this very grotesque, evil dance, where the beloved, again, is dancing around, almost making fun of him.
Mocking.
Yeah, in how it all plays out. So fascinating thing, but there's more to the orchestration too. I mean, percussion-wise, it's huge, right?
It's absolutely huge. Very innovative. It was the first instance, or at least musicologists believe that it was the first instance where a composer actually started making requests for different types of timpani sticks. You know, some with a sponge head, others with other parts using wood sticks. Before it was just generic, you know, hit the timpani.
Right,
you know.
right. And they could choose whatever they want.
Exactly,
right.
And now he's being more and more specific. Also, speaking of percussion, there's the use of offstage bells right before the tuba entrance that you mentioned. So we'll have a set of chimes, again, on the other side of the backstage. We'll have oboe on one side, the chimes over here. Again, speaking of percussion, now this actually is not in the score, but it's something I started doing when I first started performing this piece, and it tends to work pretty well, is it actually calls for 4 timpani. That is in the score, and that's unusual.
Yeah.
That
4 timpani players.
Players,
yeah,
right.
4 players, not 4 timpani.
That's right, 4 timpani players. And that's during the part in the third movement, seen in the country, where a thunderstorm starts to roll in.
Right.
So what I've done, and what we'll be doing for this concert, is having 2 of the timpani players on stage, but on opposite sides of the stage, and the 3rd and 4th in the back of the auditorium on opposite sides. So not only is it stereophonic, but it's surround sound.
Right.
Surround sound.
That's
stereo.
So thunder all around. Right?
That's right.
That's
but really coming from the distance. That's the point. The audience, you know, all of a sudden, instead of just watching and listening to a concert, they're actually going to hear thunder, light thunder, you know, rolling in behind them or off to the side.
Yeah. Very interesting. Very provocative piece too. The thing I have to admit, though, one of the things I find rather entertaining about the piece as a whole and its history is the fact that Berlioz wrote this without having met her. He finally did meet her. They even got married, and then they got divorced because they, for whatever reason, you know, apparently the infatuation did, whatever, it didn't really pan out. But in the end, if the worst thing is that we've got this fantastic piece of music, you know,
then it was worth it.
Yeah, it may have been worth it. I won't answer for Berlioz, but I'm sure having a lot of fun.
Absolutely, it's a fantastic piece.
Yeah, fantastic piece. So we'll hope you can join us at the Capitol Theater in Yakima, Washington, Saturday, February 19th, 7:30 p.m. Concert Fantastique.